And let me say a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, again for this opportunity to learn. There's so much, God, that is confusing in our world. We pray that you would help us to hang on to what is true. In Jesus' name, amen. And I want to start with just a word of thanks for your card. Several you signed. That was encouraging to me. This is first experience for me teaching at a college level class, and I'm learning, particularly with Zoom. It's a challenge. So thank you for encouraging me in this endeavor. And if there's anything I can do to make this class better, please don't hesitate to email me. Let me know your thoughts. I'm trying to improve it. So today we are heading into a lecture on invasions, decay in the church. Let me just get this screen sharing going. I have looked through this lecture, and there's going to be a chance where there's some long sections without a lot of discussion. So I'm sorry. I hope you will hold tight and hang on. But I think it's interesting stuff. And we are going to begin this just by reminding ourselves that what happened last week. And that is that we were talking about Charlemagne, and at the end of the class, and how Charlemagne's mini Renaissance really began to spread learning throughout Europe. It was a real concern of the man who helped him in Orleans that all boys, poor and rich, could learn how to read and could come to the schools there. And there was a whole flourishing of learning here. Charlemagne's empire was huge. I can't, for my own part, when I think of all the forest and woods and untilled land and wildness in that area, the fact that he had an empire that was so large, it really astounds me. But we kind of ended with a question: why didn't learning simply grow from there? The Dark Ages followed Charlemagne, what we usually call the Dark Ages, and that particular idea is in dispute among the scholars today. Was it really as dark as they maintained? Well, some of what you'll see today will show you that it was dark. And Charlemagne died in 814. And we did talk about cutting off of trade in the Mediterranean. The Arabs had taken over the eastern, southern, and western parts of the Mediterranean basin. And so a lot of trade was cut off. But these dark ages that followed Charlemagne were really also due in large part to another phenomenon, and that is that Christendom, that is Christianity and its alliance with the state in Europe, was pressed on three sides by powerful forces. On the north, from Vikings; on the south, from Saracens, Islamic pirates; and on the east, from Magyars. And this is just amazing. You might want to even think about that. Why did this occur? These huge invasions that came from the north, the east, and the south. We'll talk about that in a minute, why that might be. Here are my glasses. I can't read this as well as I like, but let's begin and look at what happened in this period. And, you know, it's difficult for us today, as we enjoy protection and peace in America with wars on foreign soils. You know, we have garbage collecting and sprinklers that work and houses and grocery stores that are filled with goods. It's hard for us to imagine the terror that faced ordinary people attempting to live ordinary lives as peasants. herdsmen or monks laboring in their fields 1,200 years ago. But think of yourself on June 8th, 793. This is Charlemagne still living. But they arrived on the shores of Lindisfarne. Remember that great island monastery on the northeast coast of England, from which Aidan and his Irish monks had evangelized Northumbria and York? There on the shores of Lindisfarne, this island, there arrived 660, I've forgotten how many ships. 793 longboats, 793. These ships were 60 to 70 feet in length and were propelled by oars and sails. They carried up to 80 warriors apiece. Now, I did the math. It seems like way too many people to invade at that time, but they could carry up to 80. And their intent was destruction. These sailors were called Vikings, from the Norse word vik, or creek, coming to mean mariners. And this is what we read in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, great book by Bede. Read it sometimes if you get a chance. Bede, we still have this book today. He wrote that these Norse or Vik came and miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and with slaughter. They carried away treasures, killed the less able monks, and enslaved the others. 2 years later, Vikings raided the monastery of Iona on the northwest side of Scotland. This was the beginning of 273 years of invasions of Great Britain and Ireland by these Norsemen. We think of these, today we have football teams named the Vikings. We think, oh, the Vikings, and we play games I did with Czech students where they get to know each other and you put out horns like this and they run at each other. But this was not fun and games. 273 years of invasions of Great Britain and Ireland by these Norsemen. Why in the world did they destroy these monasteries? Probably because they were defenseless. They were civilized, quiet places of innocence and learning, and because they contained treasures. Monasteries were among the richest and most learned places in these times. They were easy targets. Their books were covered oftentimes with jewels. Lindisfarne was attacked 5 times between 793 and 875, and finally abandoned their monastery for good in 875. Gone was Lindisfarne. Covers were torn from Bibles, and the books themselves were burned. And then you have to think about all the time. You look at those Bibles that are such national treasures today. We looked at that, the Book of Kells, the other day. Beautiful treasures. How many books were destroyed that were filled with those illustrations? It's a gift of God to us. And here I take off my teacher's hat and put on my preacher's hat, and just get us to think about all the time, even if you're just copying the Bible and making it beautiful and you have these treasures, where is your treasure? Where is your heart's treasure? The few books that were saved from those monasteries that we possess today were buried to hide them and have been unearthed. One of these great books was found in a ditch and it was buried in Ireland. As I say, Iona was first attacked in 795, and its lay and clerical inhabitants, a lay inhabitant being a non-ordained clergyman or monk, they were massacred. And after many such raids, with its riches plundered, Iona was finally abandoned in 849. Actually, it was abandoned sooner than Lindisfarne was. Its monks retreated to inland Scotland, taking along with them Columbus' bones. And one day, one by one, all the great Celtic monasteries were laid waste. All of them were. And remember how many had been planted by Irish monks. Soon the Vikings were on the shore of Ireland. And there they settled down. They wanted land as well. And Dublin, the capital of Ireland today, was founded by Vikings. It became one of the centers for their trade. Huge tracts of England, Western Scotland, and the coasts of Ireland fell to these Vikings. It was in England and Scotland, it was largely Danes who conquered and settled them, carving out an area that the English today called, or the English would call Daneland. Here's a picture of one of their ships. Here's are some of the ruins of Lindisfarne that are still there today. Iona, abandoned in 849. Of course, they have rebuilt a church there. That's not the original church. Many pilgrimages take place there. And there's Danelaw. This was the area of England that became completely occupied by Danes, Vikings, and they settled there. The Norwegians attacked the mainland Europe and Sicily. And in the summer of 1015, and I'm talking here about, just to go on and talk a little bit more about these invasions, 200 years later, in the summer of 1015, this is still not the end of their invasions, but 200 years later, King Canute of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden arrived on the shores of England with Danish army of some 10,000 and 200 longships. 14 months later, then conquered all of England. And King Canute ruled over all in England as well as Denmark, parts of Sweden and Norway. It's only because one of his descendants died childless that the throne passed back to the House of Wessex. And there on that PowerPoint, you can see Wessex is the green part at the bottom. Mercia was above it in green. And the house eventually turned back to the reign of England, turned back to the House of Wessex. And we'll talk about the House of Wessex and Alfred the Great in a minute. Otherwise, all England and Scandinavia would have been united under Danish rule. On the continent, at first, Norsemen limited their attacks to the nearby coasts of, there's another map of the Viking attacks in Europe. I'm looking at this and it looks as this is just plain history, but it's our history too. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the history of the church because the people were believers. And you have to think about what your own thoughts would be about God in the midst of all these invasions. So those are different invasions, different peoples that coming from Norsemen coming in and what they occupied during this time. And their attacks in Europe. First, they limited their attacks to the borders, and then when Charlemagne had divided his reign among his three sons, and some of that central power began to disintegrate, they came further and further inland. They ravaged Paris in 845, about the time that Iona was abandoned. Paris was pillaged by Norsemen 4 times. These cities, I don't know if you recognize them, they're very familiar to me in France, were Tours, Blois, Poitiers, Bordeaux, Angers, and Orléans were all sacked again and again. They plundered and burned their way south as far as Toulouse, that's in southeast France. They seem to have a particular fondness for sacking and burning abbeys and monasteries. They could easily set their roofs on fire. They were thatched at the time. Incidentally, it was during this period and afterwards that churches began to be built in the Romanesque style in order to create stronger and more fire-resistant roofs and buildings. And so architecture began to change because of these invasions. In France, Charles the Simple, king of the Franks, who reigned from 860 to 932, at last defeated Rollo, the Viking king of the Northmen, in the Battle of Chartres. That's west of Paris in 911. There's an old illustration of that, probably comes from one of the Bibles or Chronicles at the time, and shows him winning. And he decided that instead of telling them to go, he invited them to stay. He didn't want to have to pay them to leave. And he also said, if you stay, please protect me from other Vikings who would come to raid. And that's what happened. They stayed and settled down into what we now know as Normandy, because it was the Normans from Norway. They settled down in Normandy in France. And if you remember a map of France, that's that little peninsula that is raised there, the Manche. That means the English Channel there. So England is right across the channel. So that's where he settled. He also was required to be baptized. So Charles made Rollo a duke and baptized him and became Robert, the arch, and became of Rouen. And no, he was Rollo, sorry. His Archbishop of Rouen in Normandy baptized him. And they formed the Dukedom of Normandy we know today. And here again, I'm skipping fast forwarding again. About 100 years later, his descendant, William the Conqueror, invaded England in 1066. This was called the Norman Invasion. It's a very important date, 1066, because these Normans, along with their French mercenaries, no longer spoke Norwegian or Viking. They spoke French. And they brought French along with them to England, and that's why a third of our vocabulary comes from French. It's interesting to me. I don't know if it's interesting to you, but I really find all this fascinating. This is where our language comes from, and also how these people converted. The story is told, and I think this is sort of fun, that this King Rollo, who was conquered or in battle at the Battle of Chartres, he had to submit to Charles the Simple if he was going to stay there in Normandy. And in order to submit to him, he had to kiss his foot. Well, Rollo didn't want to do it. So what he did was ask one of his leading men to kiss the foot, and that leading man bent over, lifted up the foot, and slipped the king on his back. And that's kind of a sign of the times. So here we have all of that Norseman invasions. Oh, I thought I had a picture of that. Maybe I will later, but you know, the Norwegians also sailed all the way to Sicily on the boot of France, and they formed a kingdom there that lasted a long time, some 800 years. So they didn't just stay in France, they went south as well. So here's a question just to open it up and get you thinking. What's going on here with all this destruction and invasion? How do you understand that kind of violence in the world? And why do we have that so much today? What is this, just an island of peace that we have now? Is violence endemic to our world? How do you explain this destruction of monasteries and places of learning, this tumult of violence? How do you deal with that? And how would you deal with it as a Christian? What are your thoughts about all this? I just want to hear what you're thinking about any of those questions might be. What are your thoughts? How do you deal with that? I'm having trouble opening this back up now to seeing you all. What are your thoughts? And I realize it's not easy, but and the death and destruction doesn't end here. But how do you interpret it? Yeah, man.
So, just to clarify, are you asking about just it in general, or specifically this destruction here?
I think it could be anything you want, Matt. I have to admit there's a lot of avenues here that could open up. And
Well,
I think so. Just plain destruction that's going on against the monasteries and against these Christian peoples and
well,
violence. Yeah, man.
well, on the Vikings, I know just a little bit about the culture of that time. In order for a Viking to be deemed a man and able to marry, he had to go on one of the Viking raids and bring back a good amount of plunder. And that was part of the reason as to why there was always raiding going on from the Vikings and all of that. That's part of the reason. And another reason is just plain human greed, as you talked about.
Okay, human greed and what it meant to be a man in those days. I really appreciate that window you opened there, Matt. What does it mean to be a man? That's a huge question. Is it human strength? Is it manly strength and power? Is that what it means to be a man? How does Christianity change that? Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
I think I don't know that much about my ancestors or when they decided to, because I'm like part Irish, part Scottish, part Danish. Apparently, they were all killing each other around this time, so that's great. But I don't know exactly. Like, I could be wrong about this, but I think it's also it's a very hard place to live in the north. It's hard to grow crops. It's hard to have a good lifestyle there. And if I remember right, that's why they would go on raids, is because they needed to actually get money and get food in order to survive. And that makes a lot of sense why they go and they burn monasteries, because who cares about morals? If I can get the money to be able to feed my family and be able to grow my family, I'm going to do it.
In other words, there's only a limited amount of money out there. Get it. Monasteries have it. You can go down and grab it. Then you can get it. Then you can bring it home. You'll be a man, and not only that, but you'll be wealthier. And the climate. You mentioned climate. The north was a rude and difficult place to live and grow crops, and particularly on those little vicks, those little creeks and fjords of Norway. Fish, food. Let's go somewhere better. And that's one of the reasons the Angles and Saxons moved to England. That's another reason why these Vikings undoubtedly moved there. Better climate, more sun, more fertile land. And we got to get rid of the locals if we want to settle. Any other thoughts on this? Violence. It's so endemic. I think those are really good thoughts. I appreciate you you guys opening up those avenues of thought, because sometimes our guys' favorite movies are these, movies that glorify violence, and some guy that's stronger and he crushes all his foes. I can still be a kind of an ideal, and we can respond to it. So anyway, here we are. And unfortunately, this story about violence is not finished. Actually, let me just continue this Viking thing. And this is almost secular history here, but Vikings didn't just go west, they went east. And that whole orange area there is what's called Kievan Rus. The Rus were one of the families of the Vikings, and they moved down into Russia, and that's where Russia gets its name, from the Rus. Even though they were a pretty thinly numbered people who controlled this area, they were the overlords. Most of the people were Slavs, as they are today, but they subjugated these Slavs and made them slaves. Another name, that's one of the origins of the word for Slav is slaves. And they made slaves of them. They also, here it is. They also formed a kingdom of Sicily. And this kingdom lasted a long time till it lasted about, let's see, I've got it here, from 1071 to 1816, the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. So these guys, they also were big participants in the Crusades, because by this time they'd become Christians. Tim, you talked about your ancestors. A lot of the red hair of the Irish is in all probability a gift of the Norsemen, as is some of the red hair in Scotland and in England. DNA links the population of the Lake District. That's a northern area of Scotland from where my wife comes. A lot of DNA links people to the Vikings in those northern areas of England. At the same time as these Vikings were invading, there were Saracens who were invading. These, of course, were Muslims, and they were attacking from France's southern coasts, from North Africa and Spain, as well as a time in the 19th century, for a time from the island of, for a while they attacked the island of Sicily as well. They attacked numerous times from Spain and North Africa. And so they began to destroy Charlemagne's richest area from the old Gallo-Roman times in southern France and what's now known as Provence. My daughter is working in Provence in southeast France. They're teaching in a school. And that area is a beautiful area, lovely climate. And there are lots of old cities there in ruins. A place called Abo is there. And lots of ruins of Roman and Greek times. And these Saracens just invaded and attacked and burned again and again and again. And they created bases in southeast France and began to inhabit the area. You've heard of Saint-Tropez on the Riviera. They had a base there that was only a few miles from it. So the Muslims were encamped in southeast France for quite a while. They headed up toward the Alps, And it wasn't until 983, and you don't need all these dates, but it wasn't until 983 that the Count of Provence finally captured their base, and 7 years later in 990 pushed them out of Provence altogether. That was in 990, he finally pushed these Saracens out. But their raids continued until the 13th century. The result of that was that in this, the Catholic Church liked to talk about France as being the eldest daughter of the church because of Clovis's conversion. But this time, that heartland of Roman Catholicism was chaos. Thieves and brigands roamed the forests and outlying districts. Travel was not safe. Why would anyone want to travel outside one's own area at all? And now I'm just going to quote someone named Mark Bloch, who writes in a book called Medieval Society. It's just a brief little quote here. He says, "Great was the surprise and relief at the court of Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, when in the year 841, the prince witnessed the arrival at Troyes of the messengers bringing him the crown jewels from Aquitaine. How wonderful that such a small number of men entrusted with such precious baggage should traverse without accident these vast areas infested on all sides by robbers." The robbers lived in the forests, and they hid out there and they attacked travelers and they plundered them. Nowhere was safe. It was truly what they call the Dark Ages. So how would you imagine living in a time like that? What do we have today in America that we take for granted? Tell me, just talk to me. What do you have today that we take for granted that Christians then, believers, common believers tilling the soil, could not take for granted? What was it? Talk to me. And Tim, after you're done, I'm going to let Grace respond because she has just been altogether too quiet. And we're going to let her give an answer too. Go ahead, Tim.
So, well, I mean, we still have to worry about getting mugged and such, and people robbing your home, but that's a lot less common, I imagine, than you walk out into the woods and then someone points a sword at you.
Yeah.
And I'd also like to mention, if Grace is going to be talking, if your cat is there, I'd like to see it.
Okay, Grace. There's the challenge. So can you unmute yourself? There you are.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Okay. I don't know, just as I was thinking about it, I was thinking that, I mean, obviously right now is kind of different in the sense that we get to gather. I mean, obviously because we haven't been able to gather quite the same way recently. But I would say that if all of these like places of worship were getting attacked so frequently, that it would just be more of a privilege to them to get to do that, to get to gather together and worship.
Yeah. Imagine what it would be like to be a Christian going to worship with all this fear of Vikings or Saracens, people coming in to raid. In a minute, we're going to talk about the Hungarians, the Magyars coming in too. So yeah, just to be going to worship, think of what that would mean to you. Yeah. Yeah. How about you, Mariana? What other things do we take for granted today that they would not have?
I don't know, I just agree with what my classmates have said. It wouldn't be just a routine as how some people take it nowadays.
Yeah, routine. We just take things for granted, don't we? Our routines. It's going to be okay. Think of what it meant to be a Christian then and not to be secure in your routines. Yeah. What would be most important to you? Well, let's go on and thank you for letting me call on you. And you've done such a great job. We'll do it again. So thank you. But we didn't see Grace's cat either, did we? Okay. I'm having trouble getting it. And I'm assuming that from those sides that you showed your cat. Thank you, Grace. Well, to add to all of this mayhem, here's another problem. These people that were called Finno-Uralic people, the Hungarians, the Magyars, started coming out of the Urals, Finno-Uralic, Urals from Urals, the Ural Mountains. They started coming west. These are these people, some of whom took over and settled in Finland, others in Hungary. It's the same language root. They started coming west and they started attacking. It's also related to, I believe, to Estonian, some of them. And after slowly migrating west, they crossed the Carpathian Mountains and entered the area we now know as Hungary and northern Romania about 896. What a terrible time to live. In 907, they destroyed a Bavarian army in the Battle of Pressburg and lay the territories of present-day Germany. France and Italy opened the Hungarian raids. These people, see those arrows? They didn't just raid around those little edges. They were going all the way down into Spain and Italy, all through France and Germany and coming back home. They finally, as I said, they were in battle against the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, we talked about that. Those are descendants of Charlemagne, because Charlemagne had been crowned by the Pope and he called him the Holy Roman Emperor. And one of his sons took that title, and their empire, which existed until the early 19th century at the time of Napoleon, were fighting these people, trying to defend their lands. Finally, their king, in the year 1001, their king converted to Christianity, Stephen I, called the Saint. Now here it is. Let me just, I think I have a few other little things here. Battle of Leschfield in 955 was an important battle in which they were checked, these Hungarians. And then this is their king. It's not a photograph, I'm afraid, but this is the king of the Magyars or Hungarians. Incidentally, the name Hungary, Hun, does not come from the Huns. These were not Huns. These, the Magyars is the name, what they call their people. And in today, and if you see postage stamps that'll have Magyar, that's for the Hungarians. I don't know where the term Hungary came from, but he converted in 1001 and became, oddly enough, a bulwark against the Turks. The Seljuk Turks were also beating against Christendom shores. And this is all to show you how dark these 2 centuries were. It's almost as if some evil power had singled out the Christian church and was intent on destroying it by violence. Islam lay like a blanket over much of the Christian world, and these countries, which were ruled by Christian leaders, were devastated by Vikings, Saracens, and Magyars. And in a minute, we'll just ask the question, where help was to be found. But I want to open it up with another question here, just a kind of a philosophical one. I don't know if any of you've heard of Carl Jung, but he was a 20th century psychologist, kind of mid-century. And he delved a lot in dreams and symbols. And he said one time that when evil is destroyed in one place, and he was writing after the time of the Nazis, it seems to raise its ugly head in another. No sooner has it been brought down in one area than somewhere else in the world it rises. No period of time is exempt from it. What do you think about that comment? Do you think it's true? You think Jung was right? Evil forces in the world rise in one area, only to be brought down and then they rise in another. Is that true, or is this just some kind of a Gnostic psychologist? Yeah, Timothy.
I think so, because but maybe not for the same reasons. Because if you look at like we were talking about how the reason the people in the north came down is probably because they wanted to they needed the money and food basically, right? So out of necessity they came down. But we also know like it's pretty obvious that there's evil in everyone. And you know, I don't think anyone can really tell you like, oh, I wouldn't rob someone if I had no money and I needed to feed my children. I don't think anyone can tell you that for sure, unless they've been in that situation and chosen a different path. Because, you know, we're people, all of us have evil in us. And I think all it really takes for that to take shape is either something that breaks us to the point where we turn into a psychopath, or we end up blaming a race of people for all of our problems, you know, like you were talking about the Nazis, or it's some place where we do it out of necessity, because I don't think people want to kill anyone either. If you look at people with PTSD, with all the things that happen to you when you actually end up in a place where you hurt someone, it's not something we were built for. It's something that is completely alien to human existence. But we do it anyway because we need to be able to feed our families. It's either our survival or the survival of someone we care about that usually drives us to that. Or morality, one of the two.
Survival, our own, or someone we care about motivates this evil that will rise in the world. Any other thoughts on this? Is there a phenomenon where a broad, widespread evil suddenly rises and grips people, a whole nation? What do you think about it, Mariana? What do you think? Of course, it takes a little bit of understanding of church, of history too. So it might be knocking on the wrong doors if you don't really know, but what do you think?
Well, I think there is evil everywhere. I don't know if I would agree with what the quote that you said of when evil is defeated in one place, it gets lifted in another, because I think it's everywhere, not necessarily that it stops somewhere and then it goes into another place. Um,
So evil's everywhere, everywhere, in every heart,
yeah.
but it won't necessarily rise in a huge kind of massive way somewhere in the world, in every day, in every time. Yeah, Liz, I haven't seen you. I recognize that hand.
Yeah, just wanted to further what Mariana said. You know, the psychologist says that it's destroyed in one place. And when it's destroyed in one place, it seems like pokes his head out in another. So the Bible says that, you know, this world is conquered by sin, basically. So as Mariana says, you know, there is sin everywhere. I don't think that what the psychologist says of it being destroyed in one place is necessarily true, because we can't destroy sin. We are actually governed in a way by sin, and the only one who can conquer and destroy sin is God. What I believe happens is that in certain places, sin is suppressed by the power of Christ in us when we allow him to reign in us, when we allow him to work through us in the world around us. And sin will not be completely destroyed until Christ comes for his church, when he conquers and when he makes this world new. So until then, in a way, I agree with the psychologist. You know, in some places there is peace, there is control over it, but it's not necessarily destroyed in those places.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm not sure he meant to say that it's destroyed, evil is in hearts. And I agree with all of you in that sense, that evil is never destroyed until Christ returns. But there is a massive kind of evil that can rise at times.
Mhm.
Think of the Nazis, and then communism, Pol Pot in Cambodia, that are such horrific and massive evils. It's almost like a cloud takes over. And we look at America and we are so grateful for the safety and protection that's ours. We have to keep thinking, and this is where, Liz, I think what you're saying is right. You know, it really depends on Christ in us. We need to pray against evil, because we have to ask ourselves, could this happen in our country too? Power like the Nazis, a power like Marxism, a power like Maoism, a power like who knows what kind of, like Robert Mugabe in Rhodesia, or not Rhodesia, but in Zimbabwe, killing so many people. An evil that takes over a country and suddenly freedom is gone. And I'm trying to make you afraid. I just want you to be aware that our prayer and our own life, I think, may be key. And life might not be quite as routine. We have to be careful. What do we do to protect ourselves against those kinds of phenomena that occur? What do we do to protect ourselves? Maybe it's just God, but I think all of you have said it. In our own hearts, we really need to practice love and righteousness and truth and goodness and kindness and justice and mercy, and teach it to our children and install it in all levels of government. Honesty, love, truth, righteousness, goodness, and stand for it. Otherwise, it could happen here too. So, enough of the sermon. Once more, you don't have to go to your late week church service, because I've just preached to you. So here we go. Where was hope to be found? Well, here in England, hope came from Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great, who lived just around, I like to think he's, he died in 900, and helps give a little bit of an idea. He was king of the West Saxons. Now here's a Christian leader who is also a king. And he negotiated, he battled, he fought, he hid in forests and marshes, he made treaties, and he finally conquered the Viking Danes occupying Northumbria and East Essex, East Anglia. By the time he really gained full power, the state of England was such that he had to bring in scholars and monks from the continent as teachers in his courts. There, England and the Irish had sent so many away to the continent, now they're having to bring them back. And learning had declined so much in England that there were very few men who could understand divine services in English, even in English, or translate a single letter from Latin into English. All the educated people have been killed or taken into slavery or one thing or another. And if I'm telling you that, it's because we are here today with our learning because God had his hand on England and upon Europe in working for good and in protecting the church in the midst of all this evil and violence and badness. And in converting the Hungarians, he provided a bulwark against the Seljuk Turks, who are beginning to knock on Europe's door from the southeast and in the Balkans. And he often used kings who loved learning to do it. King Alfred started court schools. He brought in Latin scholars, and he insisted without Christian wisdom, there could be neither prosperity nor success in war. And his aim was to educate every freeborn young man in England. He wanted education. It's not often something we think about, but think about the year 900. It's over 1,000 years ago. He wanted them all educated. And so he had primary education was taught in English, and he educated he had the books, the literature translated into English, and he had monks and scholars in his court who learned Latin, and he built the walls around London again, protected his people, and finally he converted himself, the Danes, to Christianity. Scandinavia itself was converted through missionary efforts of the English. The Danes and these Vikings married local Christian girls. And they gradually converted. And these then began to send missionaries back to monasteries or back to Scandinavia, Denmark, and convert them. And at first the conversion was kind of superficial, but by the 13th century, everybody was converted in Scandinavia. And here are pictures of the churches they built. Aren't those extraordinary? They used the local material, and that was wood. And those churches date as far back as the 10th, 11th century. That's the 1000s. And there's a bunch of those still around, but not as many as would be nice, because in the late 19th century, Norwegians and Swedes began destroying these churches in order to make way for more modern church buildings. So what do you think about that? What do you think about the destruction of these churches in order to build modern churches? Is that good? Is there a place for historical memory in all of this? I am not seeing you all, so let's see. What do you think? You understand it? Out with the past, in with the new. What do you think? How about it, Grace? Give me an idea here.
I don't know. I can kind of see both sides because, like, if they're made out of wood, they might not be as sound as like newer buildings, but I don't really see the point in like purposely destroying them just because there is a lot of heritage and a lot to look back on.
Okay. So actually, they're made of wood, but they go back hundreds of years. So they're maintaining. You look that up online, old state churches, you can get glimpses inside of this polished wood inside. It's extraordinary. But yeah, we can't just hold on to the old all the time. We can understand. How about it? What else the rest do you think? What do you think? Is there a place for hanging on to historical memory in the church? Or is that something which is kind of like chains? Where is the place of the old in the church? Does it just prevent the new and what God is doing? Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I think for part of these, it does help connect us to back where the churches originated from, and these churches were from you could say tribes, peoples who at first in their own way persecuted the church, and it could be a reminder as Paul's early life as Saul was to him of where he came from and humbling him, and it could humble us as well.
I like that comment. That's very perceptive, Matt. Keep some of these anyway to help remind you where you came from. We're not just parachuted out of the sky, our churches. We have a heritage. We come from somewhere. I am disappointed when you go to somewhere like Plymouth Rock and you read a sign that says these people were just here for economic reasons. And they forget the heritage of the main movers behind the pilgrims when they came. And that was to worship God as they pleased. When we forget where we've come from and the changes that have occurred because we have converted, then it helps give us an anchor too, even though we don't want to worship these places or hang on to the old as though that had to be the only way we worship. But we need to know where we come from. All of us are heirs of that, wherever we come from. And one of the things I love to do is go back to France. I am not a Catholic. I go back to France and I come into those old cathedrals and churches and imagine people worshiping there. And remember that at one time, all of the people considered themselves Christians. They all worshiped. And that has informed every aspect of our culture. Know your roots. It also gives you humility. We're not just doing this, as Matt said, because we're smart. It gives us humility to know the gifts that have been given to us to be the culture we are today. So let's move on a little bit here. And we're going to talk about now the church. What was the church like in this dark and violent period? And here I can't really talk about what was going on in peasant lands among the farmers. Everyone was a peasant. Everyone was a farmer nearly. The churches, the cities had been destroyed. There were a few cities, and Rome was one of those. There was London that had been destroyed. It was rebuilt by Alfred the Great, as we said, and put out walls. There was Prague in the Czech, what's now Bohemia, or the Czech Republic. Constantinople and Rome. And Rome, during the last quarter of the 9th century until the first half of the 11th, reached its low point. There was attacks from the outside in all of Europe, but also the church was disintegrating at the level of its own hierarchy. And there are reasons for this, because the Pope had given himself the right, whether planned by Charlemagne or not, of crowning Charlemagne in the year 800. The papacy had a great deal of prestige outside of Italy. We need to talk about the papacy a little bit, because you need to think about this in terms of the Roman Catholic Church and some of the claims it makes about the Pope. By late 800s, the city of Rome was in chaos. Remember that the popes reigned over papal states, and there you can see a little green here. It's because they had this area that they owned too, and later on, as the centuries went past, there was more in this area, little green areas where they were also, they had allegiance to the papal power. And so papal states were like many monarchies. They were countries that were ruled over by the Pope. He was like a king. He controlled wealth. He appointed aristocrats to positions of importance in his lands. He was a religious leader with a voice that was heard throughout Catholic Europe, but just as important, he was a secular king who wielded power over his lands. And that's why the papacy became an object of covetousness, so that there was bribery here, deceit, violence, and murder. How much time do we have? 10 minutes, 11, 12 minutes. One of these popes in the early period who died in 867 was actually a man who had some integrity, and he was trying to stop the warring going on in Europe among feudal lords, because not only were there Vikings coming in and Hungarian, the Magyars and the Saracens, but in a lot of these lands, these guys that we call that are called knights rode around on their horses, and they devastated neighboring estates. They were sent out by their lords, and they robbed and plundered and raped and killed. It was a very violent time. Knights, that's their identity, to fight. And if they weren't fighting and they didn't feel like they didn't have anything to do. And so they were like mini warlords. They talk about drug lords today. That's what the knights were in much of Europe. Little warlords that go off and fight people. And the Pope, Nicholas, tried to stop this. He was a man of integrity. And so he issued documents to try to stop them. Actually, there were some documents that were forged, and Nicholas I probably didn't know that they were forged, but they were called the false decretals. And they attempted to stop all of this violence, but they also gave authority over the Pope to appoint bishops in various lands, because a lot of these bishops were appointed by kings, not by the church, but by kings. And the false decretals told people that, in actual fact, the Pope had been given spiritual authority over archbishops and secular leaders. So he was this was the time of the Pope trying to gain more and more authority over Europe. There was so much violence, it was a good thing. There was so much corruption, it was another good thing. But what we're seeing here is the growth of papal power. And at the same time, he was a monarch over his own lands. And his prestige rose until about 882, when Pope John the Eighth was murdered in his own palace. It said that when the aide who had poisoned him saw that he was slow in dying, he broke the Pope's skull with a mallet. Justo Gonzalez, in his book on Christian history, writes that from then on, Pope succeeded Pope in rapid successions. Popes were strangled or died of starvation in the dungeons where they had been thrown by their successors. At times, there were 2 popes or even 3, each claiming to be one true successor of St. Peter. In 897, Stephen VI presided over something called the Cadaver Synod. That was in 897. One of his predecessors, Formosus, was disinterred, dressed in his papal robes. He'd been dead for 8 months and exhibited on the streets. And there's a picture of a skeleton here that's all robed. Then he was tried, found guilty of a multitude of crimes, and mutilated. Finally, what remained of his body was thrown into the Tiber River. Don't try to remember these dates. Just let me just give you an overrun here, or these people. In 904, Pope Sergius III had his two rivals, Leo V and Christopher I, incarcerated and killed. Pope Sergius III had a lover, Marozia, from a powerful Roman family, and when Sergius died, his mistress Marozia and her husband, Guido of Tuscia, captured the papal palace and made Sergius' successor their prisoner, subsequently suffocating him with a pillow. After 2 further pontificates, the former papal mistress Marozia placed on the papal throne the son whom she had had from her union with Sergius III, and a grandson of Marozia was Pope 30 years later. That Pope's successor, Benedict VI, was overthrown and strangled by a brother of another Pope. And so it went, with poison and starvation, or people being thrown into dungeons. One Pope from a powerful family was made Pope at 15 years of age, and he abdicated when he was promised a financial settlement 12 years later. Another Pope was on the throne during this period, may have been a woman disguised as a man. We call her Pope Joan. And finally, this period came to an end. It was a period of shame for the church. And on December 1048, the Emperor Henry III of Germany, at the request of the people of Rome, appointed Bruno, Bishop of Toul, to the papal chair. Toul is in Alsace in northeastern France. And he began a whole period of reform that we'll talk about next Tuesday. But here we have 5 minutes. Whoa. Good for us. And I think that's it. I don't think I have any more now. So what are the lessons that we can learn from this? Talk to me. You hear the story about papal corruption, violence, death, strangling, throwing people into prison, murder, mistresses. What are the lessons here? What do you want to say? Yeah, Matt.
One lesson that the founders of America learned very well from history: do not put too much power in one place, else it will be a mad dash for it.
Oh, too much power in one place, particularly the power of the church. Wedded with secular power is a dangerous thing. It can be something really good. Alfred protected the church in England and created learning. Charlemagne created learning. Some of these great leaders did save the church in a way. But a lot of times there's huge danger there. And as Matt was saying, not only the church, anytime you put too much power in one place, anytime, whether it's religious or whatever, it's a recipe for disaster. Yeah, for greed. Yeah, go ahead, Matt. Tim. Yeah.
I mean, I know you can't tell with the mask on,
Yeah.
but I think for one, I think we should have a leader that's in the church, but we shouldn't have a leader of the church in that way. Because it's good to have like the president to be a Christian. I think that's good. But for the president to also be, well, the Pope, no, that's not good. And I also don't like the idea, and maybe it's not entirely related to all the death and murder, which I can only say, wow, it's all of that. It's a mess. But I don't think there should be one singular leader of the church declaring what is right and wrong. Because honestly, I think the job of a pastor, from what I've seen, is to guide people into like where they're lost, to be like, hey, here's what the Bible says. It's a guidance job. It's a teaching job. It's not a I am declaring what's right and wrong kind of job.
Okay, so not one leader of the whole church. Interestingly, yeah. Liz, yeah. This is also the embedded question. This is what's going to come out in your, for those who will email me. Go ahead.
So I agree with Tim, specifically because we need accountability. All humans need accountability. And if we only have one person who is deciding everything, it's going to turn into a dictatorship, and just mistakes will be made. Very heavy mistakes can be made when there is no accountability, when there is no, as the Bible calls it, a multitude of witnesses. There you go. Thank you, Matt. I believe that, yeah, if there's something to learn, is that we need more than one person to call the shots and to come in agreement. And yeah, accountability.
Yeah. What else? What can we say? Where might the Catholic Church be in error? And here I am. I'm speaking as a Protestant. I'm speaking as a what have we learned here that might overturn some of their core doctrines? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, when there's infallibility of the Pope, that's just fun, especially as they claim to come from Peter, and Peter himself had to be corrected by Paul.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, well, if you look back, don't align just one person. As Liz said, accountability, specifically in the Catholic Church, we need to always be grounding stuff on the Bible and the principles that it lays out, and not have it be on the same level as the Pope. That's dragging the Bible down to a human level. That ain't right.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the papal. There are doctrines that involve the Pope, which are that are essential to Catholicism, and he is not infallible. Although it was in the 19th century that the doctrine of papal infallibility was finally elucidated and adopted by the cardinals. And to be fair, they said it's only when he speaks ex cathedra, that is to say, out of the chair, out of his papal chair in which he is making decrees. But still, the Pope is a human being, and that office can get corrupted. They're just human beings. The Pope is not infallible. And this handing on of authority from Peter all the way down, this has never been universally recognized. It was only as the Middle Ages began to develop that the Pope began to claim authority over the whole church. It was not that way at the beginning. So even the church of his day didn't agree with it entirely. We are out of time. Looks like you're getting up to go. Well, did you want to say something, Matt, or are you just standing, eager to go? Well, thank you all for coming today. Bless you. Thank you for your papers. I'm working on those, and slowly, one by one, they will appear. Thank you, and we'll see you next Tuesday. God bless you.